A little riddle. Do you know what happens when you add this to that? Well, it gives you this. Following my review of Ghouls and Ghosts Advance, or Super Mario Advance 2, the reality, as disappointing as it may be, is that the Game Boy Advance often represented a chasm in terms of creativity. Instead of taking the opportunity to reinvent some of the Super NES's iconic series as they deserved, Japanese publishers mostly chose to honor it by mainly offering ports. And as we'll see here, not always successful ones. However, Contra Advance, the Alien Wars X, known in Japan as Contra Hard Spirits, was presented in Konami's words not as a simple port, but as a remake, nothing less than the remake of the cult shooting game on the Super Nintendo, released in 2002. Remake or patchwork? Well, let's find out. I won't beat around the bush. To me, this Game Boy Advance episode, which we can't call a port due to its hybrid nature, is nothing but a series of downgrades. Of course, there are downgrades that can be considered justified, particularly those resulting from the portable nature of the console. Screen resolution, sound capabilities, and the number of available buttons. However, it seems to me that in all these areas, Konami failed to compensate properly, either out of laziness or lack of relevance. Let's start with its graphics, an area where there's much to say. As mentioned in the introduction, Contra Hard Spirits is an amalgamation of stages taken from Contra 3 and Contra Hardcore, which, by the way, justifies its title. The idea itself isn't bad. Like Ghouls and Ghosts Advance, this could have been a clever way to repurpose a lesser-known part of the series. Specifically, the rich content of an episode that was overlooked at its release. The problem is that this required a minimum of adjustments. Similar to Capcom's approach, which, aware of the graphical disparity between episodes, took the initiative to redraw the old stages to ensure graphical consistency. Konami did not have this foresight, instead opting to alternate stages from the MD version with those from the Super NES version. I'm obviously referring to Contra 3. The two episodes are distinguished not only by their color palettes, but also by their artistic direction. Darker in Contra Hardcore's, more pastel, forgive the somewhat reductive term, in Contra 3. The low brightness of the Game Boy Advance screen also explains this choice, but Konami reduced the number of color shades from the Super NES version while increasing the exposure. As a result, the stages in Contra 3 appear washed out, losing much of their splendor without achieving perfect consistency with the Mega Drive version. I don't know if it's because of my deep familiarity with both episodes, but I couldn't help feeling like I was playing a sort of fan game rather than an official game. But the excuse of compliance doesn't even hold up, because the downgrade isn't limited to the number of colors. Many animation frames have been cut, including those of our two heroes, as well as explosion frames, and even Mode 7 effects like zooms. Is this justified by some technical limitation of the Game Boy Advance? I doubt it, given its technical specifications, but either way, the result is there. And then there's the issue of lower resolution. Again, I refer to Ghouls and Ghosts Advance to argue that this isn't necessarily a problem. Capcom managed it very well by adjusting the hitbox, the number of enemies, their speed, and even the invincibility frames to match the screen size. Unfortunately, in this case, nothing was done to adapt the game to this new configuration. The size of the heroes is disproportionately huge, which gives the impression of having a real elephant in a china shop, if you'll allow the expression, bullied by enemies that are just as fast and numerous, appearing right in front of you and giving you little time to react. Worse still, the hitbox has even been enlarged compared to the home console version, which borders on stupidity. Some phases, especially most of the boss fights, have become incredibly difficult. The motorcycle sequence, or worse, the final stage. Even the first boss will require serious reflexes. Now let's talk about the level design. While I admit that the decision to remove the Mode 7 stages and keep only the classic Contra 3 phases is justifiable, the same cannot necessarily be said for the Contra hardcore levels that were chosen. Considering the number of stages available in this episode, was it really relevant to choose these ones? The two in question are both from the same scenario, namely number 6, consisting of the aforementioned train phase and a boss rush, which, while enjoyable, are far from the best. Maybe Konami did better in terms of gameplay? Well, I regret to tell you no. Let's put aside that unpleasant feeling of lag and stiffness, which I admit may be subjective. But one thing is certain. The game suffers from an input issue that makes it downright impossible to drop down from a platform using the lower right or left diagonals. Yes, to descend from a platform, you have to press down, and only down. Otherwise, you jump. Let me tell you, this can be a real handicap, especially in that train phase, where the heroes automatically hang from the ceiling, leaving little room to shoot and avoid enemy assaults. As for the weapon system, let's talk about it. You know, one of the features of the series from Contra onwards is its clever 2-slot weapon storage system, allowing you to switch between 2 weapons at any time, or even combine them if you like. Well, none of that here. Your hero can only hold one single weapon. Some might argue that this is due to the number of buttons. It's true that we go from 6 buttons on the Super NES to 4 buttons on the Game Boy Advance. Personally, I would have preferred that they use the L button for the bomb, rather than to lock the character's aim while moving. This is actually a new feature in this game, but it is rarely useful. The lack of a second weapon is not only detrimental to the tactical aspect of the game, but also to the overall gameplay experience. You find yourself having to juggle with items, which have the annoying tendency to bounce in the air, making it difficult to get rid of them to the point that they become a nuisance. Look at this sequence, which borders on comedy, for example, and remember the smart bombs that were so useful in Contra 3? Well, they're gone too. Yes, you heard that right. And believe me, given the resolution issues mentioned earlier, these megabombs would have been very useful. Now let's talk about the worst part. Well, the worst, I'm not sure, given the previous list of delights, but I must emphasize the massive downgrade in sound quality in this version. Konami would probably claim the need to adapt the Super NES sounds to those of the MD, but this excuse doesn't hold up for a single second. To my knowledge, Contra Hard Spirits has the worst music of the entire series, ruining, in the process, the best OST of the series, that of Contra 3. Do you know what a jigsaw sounds like? Well, listen to this. The same deplorable observation applies to the sound effects, which aren't resource-intensive. So again, this excuse doesn't hold up, especially since Game Boy Advance cartridges are not lacking in capacity. Everything sounds so much cheaper. And even if it's a minor detail, I'd like to finish with the total absence of a story, dialogue, or even any end-of-level visuals. Well, there is one. But unlike those on the Super NES, it's always the same, and I find it quite ugly. To sum up, all these flaws certainly don't make Contra Hard Spirits an absolute disaster, but considering the masterpieces it derives from, this production is shameful on every level. It's a textbook example of everything not to do when porting a home console game to a portable one, unlike what Capcom managed to do with its excellent Ghouls and Ghost Advance. Shame on Konami for this unintended contribution to the worst episodes of the series.